Sandy, do you want to get started? Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. We are really looking forward to this conversation. We are about to get going. Just waiting on a few last-minute panelists to join us, but we will get going in a moment. Sandy, do you want to kick us off? Are you there?
Yes, sorry about the delay. I am here. My name is Sandy. I work for the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing and the Chicago, which partners with the Chicago Housing Justice League. And so we wanted to put on a panel discussion on social housing, past, present, and future, exactly what this all looks like. And I really want to thank the National Public Housing Museum for being such a great co-sponsor and great partner in this and a lot of other work on public and social housing in Chicago. If we want to go to the next slide, we do have
recording in progress.
I was just going to say that we do have Spanish interpretation and available. We also have closed captioning for those of you who might need subtitles, but we're just going to leave this up for a quick second so people can see how to reach interpretation if that's the thing that they need.
Para los que necesiten acceso o los que necesiten acceso a interpretación en la computadora, si van a la parte de abajo donde está la barrita, hay un globo, ahí opriman ese globo, va a salir el lenguaje que usted, de su preferencia, va a estar inglés o español. Si es español, va a oprimir el español. Si usted está en un teléfono móvil, entonces va a ir a la parte derecha, a donde están los 3 puntos, para decir more o más. Ahí también va usted a escoger, va a bajar donde dice language interpretation, y ahí ustedes van a escoger el lenguaje de preferencia, que sería español o inglés.
Okay, so we just want to go ahead and get some of the panelists to start introducing themselves. That would be wonderful. Just keep it brief. We only have an hour, but briefly introduce who you are and what kind of work you do with housing. Can we get started with Tiff Beatty?
Sure, and it's Beatty, no problem, but it's Beatty. It's all good. So yeah, I'm Tiff, or Tiffany. I'm here representing the National Public Housing Museum. So as it's mentioned, we're a co-sponsor of this. I have a few coworkers and friends of NPHM in the building, so I appreciate y'all for being here. And thank you also to our host, Annie and Sandy. And everyone excited to talk to y'all. So NPHM, just a little bit about NPHM, which is our acronym. We're the only cultural institution dedicated to telling the story of public housing in the US. We're part of an international coalition of sites of conscience, which means we believe in the power of place and memory to inform issues today and help us solve current issues. So my position is Program Director of Arts, Culture, and Public Policy. So in addition to leading and partnering on events like this one, I oversee the Oral History Archive and Core, as well as the Entrepreneurship Hub, and also the Artist as Instigator projects. So it may sound a little unusual for a history museum to be doing all of those things, but we are. It's very exciting. Really our goal, again, is to be relevant today and to really try to support the organizing and the artists and folks that are reimagining the future of housing. One project I'll just tell you briefly about is with our most recent Artist as Instigator, Tamika Lewis-Johnson, who's a Chicago-based social justice artist, most well-known for her Folding Mat project, which uncovered segregation in the city by placing homes on different sides of the city, photos of homes next to each other, and really exposing segregation. Her current project is Inequity for Sale, which she developed during her residency, is exploring homes sold on land sale contracts, which was a predatory real estate practice in the 50s and 60s, which legally stole homes from Black people. So they thought they were entering into a contract, with some of you may be familiar with contract buying, but it was predatory and also discriminatory. And so many Black neighborhoods today are still seeing the impact of that, of the fact that they were robbed of the opportunity of home ownership. So in addition to talking about public housing, we're also interested in some of these conversations that push us a little bit to think about different issues related to housing. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about social housing a little bit today. And thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Supervisor Dean Preston, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Sandy and Annie, for inviting me and for all the organizing work to put this together. Really excited for the conversation. I am on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors representing District 5. Got on the Board of Supervisors 2 years ago, and my background before that, for about 20 years, I've been a tenant rights attorney and fighting against evictions, suing slumlords and real estate speculators, and then launched the first statewide tenant rights organization, Tenants Together, and ran that, and then became an elected official. So still getting used to being the politician in the room, not the activist outside City Hall yelling at the politicians, but it, you know, while on the board, I got into office just less than 3 months before shelter in place and the pandemic was in full swing. So a lot of our work has been around eviction bans and preventing displacement, getting rent relief, and then also launching our efforts locally that I'm sure we'll talk about later, around social housing in particular. So I'll talk about those. I'll save that for later because I know we got a lot of folks to introduce and questions, but really appreciate everyone being part of this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Alderman Byron Sigcho-Lopez, can you go?
Yes, well, thank you again. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone here tonight. Byron Sigcho-Lopez, alderperson of the 25th Ward. Previously, I also worked, previously before I was elected alderperson in the 25th Ward, I was the director of the Pilsen Alliance here in Pilsen, involved in the board of directors before that for about 10 years, working on housing as a human right platform. I was involved in one of the founders of the Leave the Ban coalition. Hopefully that is fight that we continue. We also work closely with the Chicago Housing Initiative on bills like Development for All. And now, of course, we are pushing for the just cause for eviction. And more recently, we're really excited about hopefully a new blueprint in terms of what public investment looks in affordable housing and public housing. When we acquired the 18th and Peoria lots in Pilsen, which are 6.3 acres of land, where a developer was pushing for 500 luxury units. Now we'll have the opportunity to make this hopefully an all affordable housing project. So look forward to having a conversation and how we can transform and reimagine public housing, affordable housing, and housing as a human right. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Alder. Just a quick jargon check. The Lift the Ban Coalition lifting the ban on rent control. For our friends in California, there's a statewide ban on rent control in the state of Illinois. And so there's a statewide coalition to lift that ban. And then finally, our last panelist, Araceli Lucio. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, my name is Araceli Lucio, and I'm a member of PICO. And I live in the first building that PICO has. And I've been a resident of Pilsen for 16 years. And I am so happy to be part of this co-op because this gives me the opportunity to stay in the neighborhood and also to give others the opportunity to stay. Y voy a seguir en español porque me siento más cómoda hablando en español. Pero estoy aquí representando a la cooperativa de Pico. Nosotros somos un grupo de personas que estamos uniéndonos para comprar los edificios y vivir en estos edificios de personas que han estado en el vecindario por muchísimo tiempo. Nosotros queremos estar en el vecindario y sabemos que este es una de de los caminos que nosotros tenemos para poder quedarnos y poder contribuir a que otras familias también puedan quedarse en el vecindario. Actualmente tenemos 2 edificios que hemos comprado como cooperativa y estamos muy orgullosos de decir que somos un proyecto que somos autosostenible, ya que no hemos recibido ningún financiamiento del gobierno. Hemos recibido algunas becas de algunas fundaciones y esto nos ha permitido dar la oportunidad a otras personas del vecindario para que puedan mantenerse en el vecindario. Estamos muy estamos muy deseosos de que el gobierno y los bancos puedan ofrecer nuevas oportunidades para otros residentes para poder mantenernos en el vecindario, y también estamos muy deseosos de que nos puedan apoyar con otras iniciativas y otras leyes para que más personas puedan tener estas oportunidades que nosotros tenemos. Muchas gracias y gracias por invitarme.
Wonderful. So just hopping right into it, for those of us for all the attendees, we do have some pre-written questions for all of our panelists, but we also want to solicit questions from you all. We're going to go with the pre-written questions first, but if at any point during the talk you have any questions, either for a specific person or for every panelist, feel free to put in the chat and we will get to it at the end. So the first question is going to be for Tiff. Can you provide a sort of brief history of social housing, both in Chicago and generally?
Yes, and I will try, and I will also give a disclaimer to the historians in the room that I am not one. So fact check me as you wish in the chat or at the at the Q&A. Just please, I need it. And I will also be transparent in saying a lot of this information comes through my work as, again, the program director, working directly with historians and also scholars and interns at different levels who are digging into this history and thinking about, again, how to connect it to our work, which is very much, in the present, using history to solve the most pressing issues today. So just want to throw that out there. But as I understand it, the early history, thinking about Chicago specifically, and other urban centers, the settlement houses were really, I think, one of the earliest forms of what we might call social housing, in the sense that this was housing provided for folks, and it was a part of sort of a community effort. These were more affluent white folks, as well as religious figures who were primarily providing this housing for white immigrants to assimilate into American culture. A lot of those programs actually discriminated against people of color, and that's a trajectory that we see repeated over and over again, as well as disinvestment in communities of color. So the federal government, in a lot of ways, sort of took its cue from those settlement movements as they, during World War I, started to create military housing or housing for military families. That was sort of another sort of predecessor, you might say, to what we know today as public housing. And again, that's another situation where there was discrimination and Black families weren't necessarily invited, and in some ways, very explicitly discriminated against. And the Great Migration is where we saw really the influx, the first Great Migration. We saw Black families coming to northern cities like Chicago, where there were a plethora of jobs, but not as much housing. So there was a housing shortage, and there was also a lot of overcrowding in Black communities because, again, there was discrimination, there was racial violence, and just a lot of issues that were based in race that forced Black communities to become overcrowded and eventually become slums, which paved way for slum clearance. And that is, even that term is controversial more so comfortable in the poetry lane, I would say that, James Baldwin, I would quote him, he called it Negro removal. And so that was something that, again, we sort of saw happening in the 30s, and that would continue. And so, public housing eventually was created in that New Deal era. The Public Works Administration was really the first major investment in public housing. Some, folks will say that Techwood in Atlanta is the first development. That was another example. Techwood was all white, was, intended that way. And so, that really sort of, it was a trend that continued. In Chicago, we also had a public housing that was built here. For those of you who are familiar with Altgeld Gardens, Cabrini Green, the Jane Addams Homes, which is the former Jane Addams Homes is the future home of the museum. So just a little bit of history about that to kind of like fast forward a little bit. So you had this trend of disinvestment, and eventually these public housing communities were demolished. The buildings themselves, as well as the residents, were displaced for the most part. There are still public housing communities like the Cabrini Green row houses, and those developments on the near River North, that Gold Coast area, that are fighting to keep their homes. Jane Addams Homes was one of those buildings that was advocated by public housing residents to keep it. Once they realized that it was going to be impossible to keep it as housing, they advocated for it to become a museum. So that former public housing building was turned into a museum to preserve the stories, preserve the culture and the policies that went along with public housing, and really, created the situation that we're in right now, which is that public housing has been completely disinvested in. There really hasn't been any alternative like you see in places in Europe, where they have these ideas of social housing that are for, low, but also middle class people, and you have more diversity within the public housing or within the social housing. It's been predominantly since the 50s, when the white flight happened. It's been predominantly Black and brown and poor. And so that has further exacerbated the disinvestment of public housing. And so that's where we're really at today. There's been, again, there's an ongoing fight. There's an ongoing movement. I think we have some people in the room from New York, where they are fighting to save Section 9. So Section 9 is traditional public housing. Some of you may be familiar with Section 8, which is the voucher program that started in the 70s, that really helped to privatize the public housing. And so there's more and more the RAD program, which is the rental assistant demonstration, Hope 6. These are all just different, basically tools of the same sort of neoliberal agenda, which is to really put profit over people. And so that's what we're continuing to see today.
Wonderful. Our next question is going to be for Alderman Sigcho-Lopez. What is the role of social housing in fighting displacement, homelessness, and gentrification?
That's a great question. In terms of the narrative that has unfortunately dominated U.S. policies in recent decades, is really has gone really far in terms of the demonization of almost public housing. I'll say, the lack of investment in public housing is evident. The Chicago Housing Authority, as we speak, has over $200 million in reserves, as we have people who are homeless and many who are in stable housing. The latest estimate, I think, was we got at least 60,000 residents who are experiencing homelessness or in stable housing, and a shortage of 120,000 units of affordable housing as we speak. It is clear that the market is not going to address the crisis. It is clear that the supply-demand simplistic, the draconian economics only serves the interest of the private sector and those developers who have and realtors that have continue to push their agenda to the point again, and I'm glad that was for people who are not here in Chicago, from Chicago, Republicans went as far as putting a ban on rent control, an unconstitutional ban. So even the quote unquote democratic processes are really not followed when it comes to real estate and development. So for us, in order to create, stability, because I think that's what we got to look into the housing and in our neighborhoods like here in Chicago, what we ask and the people really need is the stability. We have a serious crisis where property taxes double or triple overnight. That is what's happening. So protecting naturally occurring affordable housing in those conditions and with such a rate of speculation is nearly impossible. And you add to that a broken property tax system. And again, I'm sure across the country you've seen the sad indictments and corruption cases in Chicago. A lot of this is really traced to the broken property tax system when you have elected officials who directly benefit by their law firms being tax appeals experts and obviously with direct conflict of interest in not wanting to address that issue. And when you have agencies like the Chicago Housing Authority not investing in public housing, because again, we have continued this constant redlining banks who don't lend, to low income Black and brown homeowners. And then when you come to the tenants, you have tenants who are completely unprotected. In fact, there has been attempts to even take back many of the tenant rights legislation that were gained under the Mayor Harold Washington. So when we have a narrative that really makes it almost impossible to invest in affordable or public housing is demonized. What we have seen is more and more push for market rate, what is called market rate, right? The market rate push and the tragic reality that we have in the city of Chicago where almost 300,000 Black residents have left entirely the city of Chicago. I mean, the disproportionate effect on our Black and brown tenants is the direct result of draconian neoliberal policies that failed the vast majority to benefit a few. If you look at Chicago in the midst of the crisis, we have thousands of vacant luxury units, but yet we don't address that. In the meantime, we have a shortage of affordable and public housing, and the government is kidnapped by these developers and corporations who set the tone on the legislation. They have made it impossible to look for rent control, despite our efforts, and I want to be sensitive of time, but I think there's a lot to unpack here. But when we had even a promise by Mayor Lightfoot on the just cause for eviction ordinance, mainly making sure that tenants are not displaced overnight with 30-day notices in the middle of a pandemic. We had a promise. If you look into the Poverty Summit by Mayor Lightfoot, one of the main promises is to address the issue of displacement by implementing policies like just cause for eviction. The minute that realtors and developers start with inflammatory and doomsday language, all elected officials start backtracking and we're back to square one. So when we talk about stability, we need to also talk about investment. So we do need to invest. I mean, we look at programs like in Germany, when they have an aggressive program to build 400,000 units per year. In the city of Chicago, we're lucky we do 2,000 units in the last round of emergency funds. And housing is the cornerstone of our communities. So we got to make sure that we invest in public housing and affordable housing, that we regulate the private market so that we don't allow developers to do as they please and in cahoots with elected officials in a broken property tax system, so that we have just cause for eviction, that we lift the ban on rent control. So there's no silver bullet, but what I'll say is that the combination of policies will make sure that we have stability in our neighborhoods, in our communities. That's the best way to address this unfortunate legacy of segregation and displacement. Corruption in our neighborhood, in Pilsen alone, in one of the neighborhoods that I represent, displaced over 14,000 residents in over a decade. There's nothing normal with those trends. You connected directly to the corruption, to the lack of investment, and the lack of action. In a time where we need bold action in government, we have seen quite the contrary. they're dominated by developers and corporations. And I think that's the biggest task, the task to get big money out of politics so that we can push forward with legislation that talks about investment and not speculation.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about specifically government-owned and government-subsidized housing, but that is not the only kind of non-market housing. So this next question is for Araceli Lucio. What is the process of establishing a co-op, and what is the role of co-ops in Chicago's housing sphere?
Bueno, una de las primeras cosas que nosotros empezamos a hacer como residentes es
Araceli, I'm sorry.
a las personas que estaban listas para que
Araceli, I'm sorry, can you
en
speak in English?
Pilsen
Oh.
y que estaban listas para ser dueños de casas. Nosotros estamos
Araceli, you muted yourself.
And Araceli, if you could speak in English, we have Spanish interpretation that's available for people to be able to switch over to Spanish to be able to listen in.
¿Me pueden escuchar?
You're good now. Can you speak in English, and then there's interpretation available so
No
people
puedo
can.
escuchar ahora.
Yeah.
Okay. ¿Me pueden escuchar?
So we can hear you. Yeah, we're able to hear you. There is live interpretation in Spanish, but also you should feel free to continue however makes you most comfortable. But there is interpretation in Spanish already, just so you're aware.
Okay, so lo que mencionaba es que nosotros como residentes empezamos a ver que nosotros ya estábamos amenazados por las personas que estaban llegando al vecindario para nuestros servicios a precios que eran inalcanzables por los residentes. Lo que nosotros estamos haciendo todo el tiempo es estar identificando a las personas que están perdiendo ya sus viviendas debido a que no pueden pagar los altos impuestos. Estamos trabajando con estas personas para poder negociar con ellos y permitir que ellos se puedan quedar en sus edificios también. Para nosotros ha sido un reto poder encontrar a las personas que quieran ser parte de la cooperativa, y es por la manera en la que los developers están llegando al vecindario, están ofreciendo altas cantidades de dinero para las personas que están en situaciones difíciles, y esto ha sido un reto para nosotros, pero nosotros de la forma en que estamos trabajando es identificar a los dueños de viviendas que ya están listos para vender sus edificios y quieran negociar con nosotros, y también identificar a las personas que están listas para ser dueños de casa. Las cooperativas creo que es la única forma de
homeowners. The cooperative, I believe, is the only way that the Pilsen residents can stay in Pilsen and they can be homeowners. And this allows for the buildings not to be sold, because we are the ones that we want to keep as a home. And we also want the folks to feel that it's not impossible, but it's something that can be done as long as there's someone that wants to do it. I think that we also are very fortunate to be able to buy the first building, because the owner was somebody that was elderly and he was ready to sell the home. And he believed in Pico, and that was the way that we were able to obtain the first apartment, the first building. Unfortunately, in Chicago, there's not a lot of support for the co-ops, and there's still not any laws that can help so the residents could be part of those co-ops in a way that's more accessible. And unfortunately, we need to work a lot more so that way we can maintain the folks in their communities.
Okay, thank you. So actually, as Alder Sigcho-Lopez indicated, there is a lot of opposition to a lot of this. And so my next question goes to Supervisor Preston. It's about, how do we actually enact the political will? How do we build the political will to actually make these things policy? How do we actually make them pass?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, there's quite a bit of opposition. I think we all know that, and probably are all facing a lot of the same opposition. I will say that in San Francisco, we tend to, everyone sort of calls themselves liberal / Democrats, and they're, still is strong opposition, but it's a little different. So I will just start with that caveat that we don't have like a huge sort of right-wing Republican base to deal with like some folks do in other parts of the state or other parts of the country. When it comes to things like housing, it doesn't make much of a difference. The neoliberal Democrats and corporate types are equally opposed to all our efforts as the right wingers are. They just pretend not to be. But it does mean for us, like when you talk about issues like social housing or more broadly about affordable housing, you're starting, there's some level in San Francisco of acceptance of that idea. It doesn't reduce the opposition, but we are a city that like is dramatically overproducing market rate housing, and to the Alderman's point, it's just it's exacerbating a displacement, providing homes for mostly white folks and almost exclusively very wealthy folks, and we are dramatically underproducing any form of affordable housing, right? So what we did when I came into office, within a few months, we put forward a transfer tax on real estate. And in California, we have Prop 13, so we have significant limits on how we can tax real estate. But one thing we can tax is when it's sold, the actual transfer, the seller pays a percentage. It's usually a tiny little percentage. Most counties barely charge anything. When I took office, at the highest bracket, it was like 3%. So we came in saying, hey, we want to tax these folks who are selling high-end properties and use that money for social housing. So the recommendations to us were like, wait, it's not a good time. We're in the middle of all kinds of stuff with COVID, bad time to tax people, then no one's going to vote for it. And then even those who were supportive were like, why don't you do a very small, like 0.25% increase, and that'll raise lots of money. And we kind of did the opposite. So we put forward a measure called Prop I to double the transfer tax on properties $10 million or more. So it's all the downtown office buildings, hotels, apartment buildings, anything that sells in San Francisco sells for more than $10 million. We're like, if you're rich enough to own $10 million property, you can pay a little more money. And we wanted that tax to be big enough that it also would give an incentive for sellers of apartment buildings to sell them to the city. So we have an exemption, like we do not charge the seller the transfer tax if they sell it to the city. So that went to the ballot. We were outspent 20 to 1 by a coalition of basically the California Realtors Association, which is sort of the most moneyed opponents up there with the landlords. And also our local, we have like 75 billionaires in the Bay Area. And I don't know what percentage of them, but a hell of a lot of them lined up in opposition. Total bogus campaign claiming this was like a tax on small businesses, to which we said, find us a small business that owns a $10 million property, right? And anyway, when we framed the messaging, given that Donald Trump was trying to sell a big building he owns in San Francisco, that was certainly, we sent out mailers kind of tying the opponents to Trump. I mean, real estate developer in chief, and like they absolutely, the opposition fell flat. Like we won 58%. It wasn't even that close. Just kind of blew them out of the water and passed this tax with a really broad coalition that is now estimated to bring in $176 million per year permanently forever, with the stated purpose being for social housing. We also put on the same ballot another ballot measure called Prop K, which explicitly authorized San Francisco to create up to 10,000 units of social housing, something that is prohibited by a horrible racist state law in California. You have to go to the ballot to get, if you want to build, housing for rich folks, you don't need to go to a ballot. But if you want to build municipally owned housing for low income people and people of color in San Francisco or anywhere in California, you actually got to go to the ballot under a horrible thing called Article 34 in California. So we got that authorization at the same time. That passed by like 75%. It was 75% voted in favor of that. So we've got now the money's rolling in. The fight is still there with, the same kind of neoliberal and corporate Democrats, including our mayor, including all the so-called, YIMBY folks and all the other cheerleaders for market rate development, fight us every step of the way in allocating the funds. We recently allocated $64 million to a fund that had never had much of anything in it. That was for acquisition of buildings where there was a threat of displacement of tenants for the purposes of creating land trusts. Like I said, the most that program had ever had was like a 2 or 3 million in a year, and they do a couple deals. We did an appropriation that the mayor fought every step of the way that we got through that allocates the $64 million out of the first batch of Prop I money specifically for creating land trusts through acquiring these properties. And we're also seeing other tools like state programs for acquisition of hotels for permanently supportive housing. Like, it's much easier now to do these deals in San Francisco where the city comes in and buys the property, because for the seller of like a $20 million property, right, being immune now from or exempt from a 6% tax on that sale gives a huge advantage to the city as a buyer. And so we're able to like acquire far more of these buildings. We're also in the process, we created a housing stability oversight board that's making recommendations at the end of this month on how to use these funds. Really amazing list of some of the things that have been discussed, limited equity co-ops, land trust options, and municipal housing strategies as well. So, and then we'll go into the budget cycle to allocate the funds. I would say it's one last thing in terms of the reality of what we're up against that wouldn't usually come to mind, but is really crucial I think in building the political coalition and overcoming some of the opposition, is addressing what always gets thrown in our face, at least, which is that it's more cost effective. Right. For those who are fans of affordable housing, there are always more cost-effective options where the tax credit program or other things where there are matching funds available. So in San Francisco for years, part of why we couldn't get money allocated for social housing is because people would say, hey, you can get for half the money, right? You can leverage this other source if you do these kind of public-private partnerships, all these other models of doing housing, as opposed to if you're doing pure municipal housing or land trust or co-op, there's no federal or state program really to tap into. So it's more expensive for the city. So even those who are affordable housing champions have pushed back for years on doing these other strategies. So when we did our ballot measure, we explicitly said to these folks, look, we're not going to compete for those existing affordable housing dollars. We're going to grow the pie. Right. That was like the whole theory was like, sure, maybe it's more expensive to do municipal housing. Maybe it's more expensive per unit to do a land trust. Right. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. Let's just tax rich people and corporations more so we have more money and we can do both. And that has worked. But I will say we're still fighting that battle. When we try to allocate the money, we're still getting pushback from the mayor, from the same people who opposed Prop I in the first place, who are just saying we should redirect all those monies to existing affordable housing strategies. So if you can, and you have a way to do it, and you have voters who are willing to adopt these policies, the more you can lock in the expenditures at the ballot, the better. So I'll stop there because I know we have limited time, but be really excited to talk with any folks who want to learn more about our efforts with Prop I and winning these kind of funds at the ballot. But we were really encouraged just by the appetite among voters, even when they were faced with this massive multi-million-dollar disinformation campaign against our measure.
Thank you so much. I love that framing of growth. You have to grow the pot instead of competing against what's already there. I think that's fantastic. So this next question, and it's a big one, but this question is for anyone who wants it, anyone who has thoughts. Just what is our roadmap to abundant, affordable housing for everyone who needs it, that is guarded from the market? How do we get here? It might not need to be a super detailed roadmap, but like what are we looking at actually in making this a reality for people?
Well, I can take a stab at it just quickly in terms of one of the recent developments, 18th and Peoria, which is a site in Pilsen, in a community that again has been suffered the consequences of the corruption and lack of government action when it comes to creation of affordable housing and social housing. The 18th and Peoria lots is a site of 6.3 acres that we recently acquired after a settlement with a previous developer from New York that was pushing for a previous plan under the now former and disgraced alderperson Solis, where the community fought the development of 500 luxury units with very little affordability. I think that at the time they were proposing the minimum of 10%. That was the 10% affordable requirement ordinance that former Mayor Emanuel had for quite some time. The settlement that we enter, I think it can be an example of how we need to reimagine, and we got to, in terms of pushing back on these narratives of the free market and the invisible hand, quote unquote. When we came in, it was important that we have a conversation with our community about what are the needs and what are the priorities of our community, not the developers, not the special interest groups, but what are the needs and the priorities of our community. And affordable housing, especially family-oriented, affordable, truly affordable public housing is critical right now. Families have experienced significant displacements, the homelessness situation, and the most vulnerable residents have been left out of the conversation. So it is critical that we discuss with our residents what we want to see in these sites, and zoning development has to be inclusive, community prerogative. What we talk about in Chicago when this misconception about mayoral prerogative or aldermanic prerogative, it truly is community prerogative, but needs to inform our decisions, what the community want to see. So what I said is, and what these 18th and Peoria lots are so important, is because when we came in and we wanted to discuss a settlement that will bring those lots back to the city, it was almost like we were speaking a different language. It almost was that we're completely talking about something not feasible. So when we talk about the power that the community has, it is important that we know what our alternatives are, that we envision those priorities. So despite the objections of the administration that were basically pushing for a settlement that will quote unquote get a compromise to the table, a compromise that was simply not acceptable to the community, we trudged forward and we said, well, we would like to make sure that we settle, and there's no reason why we cannot have public land in this site. So we entered a settlement. We spent $12 million, and there's a whole new story about how we can be, that shouldn't be the case. But we acquired the land in $12 million. I tell you, the city of Chicago invested $2.3 billion with a B to subsidize luxury housing. So when they talk about it was too expensive or we cannot afford it, we got to look things into context and why the priorities of housing and investment of housing is so important. We do have now the opportunity, now that we have public land, to invest and envision, what public housing and affordable housing and social housing can look like in the city of Chicago. This is an open invitation for all of us, especially our constituents or residents, to be part of that vision. So as such, we have embarked in a new chapter in our community when we plan with our community. Our goal, of course, is to, given the size of the lots, to have at least 280 units of truly affordable housing. We need to talk about hitting the average median income or local communities, and not as it wasn't before, like 60% AMI, which often left out most of our constituents and community. So building also the equity that Araceli was mentioning in the COP. How do we invest in housing that is also permanent for our communities? So I do think that these are the kind of projects where we can envision, plan, and coordinate efforts directly with our communities. Our communities are savvy. We don't need the technocrats. We don't need the people who come and tell us from up to down what is possible and is not, because we fall into a social imaginary that is super limited. When we talk about now, we have an open canvas, a blank canvas, and we want to make sure that we all paint collectively. What is the vision? We hope to be a new blueprint of what social housing can look like in the city of Chicago. How can we battle this legacy of segregation and exclusion and marginalization that is very much by design? And start there. Planning decides are super critical to redefine and reimagine social housing in Chicago. This can be an opportunity also to engage with other entities like the Archdiocese of Chicago that has continued to sell properties for development, for luxury in the middle of a pandemic. So making sure that we look at those institutions as opportunities where we can re-envision these spaces to continue the service to our community. And housing is the cornerstone. So how we continue developing and building collectively on a vision of affordable housing, social housing, public housing that I tell you has overwhelming support of the community, but very rarely these alternatives are even considered. The last thing I like to say is that, unfortunately, like San Francisco and other states, the city of Chicago is the only major city across the country where we cannot have ballot initiatives that come directly from the communities. That is a big problem. We're actually working with former Governor Quinn on that so that we can have, we can strike that statute, and we are able to have referendums coming from the community so that we can ask and we can get such ballot measures as the vacancy tax, right? There's a great initiative, and other initiatives that we can put forward and need a democratic vote. We cannot allow a small group of developers and billionaires with a very radically wrong agenda to dominate the narrative and what's possible when the vast majority of working class people in the city of Chicago believe and will support social housing. So this is a measure that I think would be important so that we can also follow suit to what Dean was sharing in San Francisco. And I think if we're still talking about democracy in terms of the city of Chicago, I think that elected officials have to allow residents and communities to put these measures on the ballot. So I hope that these projects to strike down these very undemocratic measures so that residents are not able to put ballot measures up for a vote can be changed as well.
Great, thank you. So this is a question from the audience. This is also for anyone who has thoughts. So this is coming from a student who is looking to explore more sustainable housing models that also combats the concerns of displacement and gentrifying neighborhoods. So how can we ensure the diversity remains even as neighborhoods evolve? And how does this tie into areas that have seen great blight and don't have much of a community identity left?
I can try to kind of speak to that, but I am very interested in this question. So forgive me for thinking out loud. Don't know if I have an answer, but I'm very interested in thinking about, especially in Chicago, where you have a city of neighborhoods, right? A world-class city, because we have, so many different cultures and ethnicities that have made Chicago home and really defined Chicago as a city of really many sort of world cities. And I think about, particularly, I think about Chinatown, and I think about Paseo Boricua, which is in Humboldt Park. It's the business district of that area. It's a predominantly Puerto Rican community, which has really, for me, sort of modeled what political power can look like. A lot of folks in that community who are doing a lot of the work there were inspired by the independence movement from Puerto Rico. They actually negotiated because they wanted to install this statue of Pedro Albizu Campos, who is very controversial in some conversations, but in the Puerto Rican independence movement, he's a hero. And so knowing in some ways that that would never happen, that gave folks a bargaining chip to advocate for these gigantic steel Puerto Rican flags to be put in the community on both sides of this walkway or this paseo. And so for that community, I've just been watching sort of how that's really developed, and connecting business and economic activity to culture, not only with the flags, but also the facades on the building are reminiscent of San Juan, and really just bringing everything, every sort of tool that they have in their toolbox to the conversation. It's about money, yes, but it's not just about money, because our culture is also powerful. Our culture is abundant, and that goes for all of us, people of color whose culture was stolen, whose languages were stolen, that we have to tap back into our power and who we are. And a lot of us come from communities that are more communal. Just we're thinking about even some of the West African influence that still is embraced by the African-American community in Chicago. So this idea of Ubuntu, or these concepts that are really about I am because we are, these concepts of connection that the American sort of individualistic kind of society tries to drive out of us. But it's still there. I still see remnants of that. And I think if we can tap into that, we have a lot of power there. So that's what I see.
And I would just add on the question around like ensuring that folks remain as the neighborhoods are changing, that I also think it's that like not losing focus on the defensive things that help keep people housed, right? I think there's so often an effort to try to separate folks doing anti-displacement, anti-gentrification, pro-rent control, pro-just cause for eviction protection, like all those kind of things, from folks who are doing more long-term, like visionary work around social housing, and they're absolutely 100% connected. Like I think tenants unions and forming strong local tenants unions are probably the single most important ingredient in preventing the displacement and having the people still there to, whether you're in Chicago and don't yet have the ability to vote on a ballot measure. It's all kind of academic if like everyone's living outside the city because they've all been displaced, right? And so I know in San Francisco and in a lot of cities, it's like the most successful efforts really link the anti-displacement work. Like there's no way we would pass the Prop I mentioned, or the vacancy tax we're about to do, or elect like a Democratic socialist like me, or if we didn't have rent control in San Francisco and anti-eviction protections, like there would be pretty much no low-income working class community left in San Francisco. And so even though it's become partly it's sort of a playground for the rich over recent years and whatever, there's still like the majority of voters are actually working class folks and low-income folks who are still trying to hang on in Francisco. And that's happening because of those direct anti-displacement protections and rent control. And we have the same battle, to keep them. I mean, the landlords went to the ballot to abolish rent control. They go to the ballot. They're going to go to the ballot to take away our right to vote, enact these kind of taxes. That's probably going to be on the same ballot this coming year, actually, as the tax we're proposing. So it's a constant fight to keep that stuff. But I just think it's really important to always center the direct anti-displacement work, even though it's not the most satisfying in some ways, because it's constantly defending against displacement and not providing long-term security. And those are also the tools we put in the way that enable us to do and acquire these properties and do things like land trusts and all that. If those protections weren't there, landlords would just clear out the building and convert them, next week.
Great, thank you so much. I actually wanted to turn now to another audience member, LaDawn Youssef. I actually met LaDawn a couple years ago. I went up to Minneapolis to write about the privatization of public housing up there, and LaDawn is a fearless tenant organizer who lives in one of the properties that was they were attempting to turn it into mixed income housing, which, as many of you know, with public housing is this very misguided idea of, middle class rich folks way of life will be better for public housing residents to be around. In any case, lots of problems with it. LaDawn was raising some concerns about the term social housing compared to public housing. And so I'm going to let her say a few more words about that. And I think that'll be an interesting way to, we'll probably have one more question after this, but maybe a kind of a near closing question. What do we do with the terminology here? So LaDawn, you should be able to talk now. See if you can.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. I thought that I would, I'm just gonna make a quick statement about this, and I thank you, Annie. It was great seeing you for letting me speak. Okay, my name is LaDawn Youssef. I am from Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition in Minneapolis. And we've been fighting to stop the privatization of public housing and the displacement of public housing residents from public land. And we've been fighting nonprofits and developers from profiting the sale of public housing since 2014. I have been a long time public housing resident. I raised my family here, and Anne was kind enough to come to Minneapolis and see really what's going on, and wrote a wonderful article about us. So this is what we feel about social housing. Social housing is misleading. I know that a lot of DSA members and the Democratic Socialists are pushing this nationwide, but I, as a person of color, as a Black woman, as an Black immigrant woman who's been in public housing, I didn't come up with that term, the new term that's being used. It is not a term that was created by Black and brown, low-income Black and brown residents in public housing. I believe it's rooted in whiteness. Social housing is basically saying that nonprofits and et cetera can take over public land and profit from the privatization of public housing. Please be clear about this term and what the consequences of this term of social housing means. Why are you not advocating to build more public housing and to stop evictions in public land? Affordable housing is not affordable for the poor, low-income people and people that are homeless. We need to be real about what this means. Social housing is another term that is normalizing the privatization of public housing. We support and we give a shout out to all the New York residents that are fighting to stop the privatization of public housing and Greg Russ's blueprint. Building public housing is much cheaper than affordable housing or social housing. In Chicago, Tracy Scott is running the housing authority there. She came from Minneapolis, and she was handpicked by the czar of privatization and gentrification nationwide called Greg Russ. She was the deputy director here, and now she's in Chicago pushing to end whatever little public housing that was left. And she also helped end public housing in Atlanta. So we need to understand that this new term social housing is not going to be safe for public housing and public housing residents. If you really want to build public housing and stop the crisis, because San Francisco is known for ending public housing. And there's an article called the San Franciscation of Minneapolis, because that's what Minneapolis wants to be. And the homelessness are doubling, the homeless crisis. Greg Russ is using something called opportunity atlas mapping to displace public housing residents. And now they have this term called social housing. Okay, maybe as the other person from the museum said, it was something that was acceptable and that was something that was used back in the day. But right now, with the way that public housing is not being talked about as a public land, a public good, is very dangerous. And it is dangerous to me as a public housing resident when the DSA members nationwide are saying, we're going to push the social housing. Have they talked to public housing residents? Have they even figured out what is going on in New York City or in Minneapolis? So I am really concerned about this term social housing. It doesn't fit us. We didn't create it. It's another way that will end up finishing whatever public land is left. And let us not confuse with public housing what affordable housing is. Affordable housing is not affordable to public housing. And public housing is 30% of our actual income. for rent. Affordable housing is whatever the AMI is, and it is based on the AMI that is from rich, wealthy people, and we have to pay rent according to their AMI. So I just wanted to say those few words. I want to thank Annie for letting me speak. If you guys want to follow our work and how we're fighting to save public housing, I will be able to put stuff in the chat, and we can go from there. But I just think that it's very dangerous to use this term public social housing interchangeably with public housing. It is another way to support affordable housing, and the privatization is another way to normalize the ending of public housing, and that's the dangerous part. So thank you, Anne, for letting me speak.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone so much for attending. This has been a really fantastic discussion. We do have one question left, partially for a little bit of clarification. It is a little bit of a technical one. And so if technical questions aren't your jam, feel free to hop off. But we are just going to have one more question, and then we're going to be done with the evening.
Sandy, real quick,
so-
can we let the panelists respond to that? I would love to hear. I feel like that was a big,
Yeah.
lots of stuff in there. I feel like there's some
That's
thoughts.
fair. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I like to respond. I think it's a very important, and I think semantics and I think or narrative matters. I think again, I think that there has been a big part of the attack on public housing, also the narrative that is being used to demonize public housing. I also think that again, in my own work, we use public housing in all the work that we do. In fact, 18th and Peoria, one of the first conversations that we had, was with HUD, because we do need that investment to make this public affordable housing. I think that it's also important to recognize that a lot of our institutions have been also marginalized immigrant residents. A lot of institutions, I tell you, here in Chicago, for instance, just up to recently, one of our institutions, the Chicago Low Income Trust Fund, opened up the vouchers to anyone, regardless of the immigration status. So to say that is important, yes, I agree on the criticism to make sure that public housing is not something that continues to be demonized in our communities, especially. We have to make sure that we understand, and I think I'm glad that the concept was explained in detail. The 30% AMI, that's actually what our communities are fighting for. And we're also making sure that this is open to every human being, right? That's another thing that is important, that we look at housing as a human right. That is the framework. Again, I cannot speak on behalf of the Democratic Socialists of America, although I am a member, but I tell you that in our community, we do push for public housing and both affordable housing, because that's how our institutions work. We actually are very familiar with the work of Tracy Scott, as well as the planning commissioner, Mr. Maurice Cox, who comes from Detroit, and he comes from, he also comes after New Orleans as well. So this is what we, would refer as bureaucrats that come in with an agenda, and I think Mayor Lightfoot has done a lot to bring a lot of that. The dismay and the disarray of public housing institutions is the result of these policies, right? So as I explained, that's how we look at it from the ground for people who are working on the ground. I also think I challenge us to have a conversation, right, with the DSA members and DSA at large, so that we can all understand those terms and use it properly. I think that is a criticism that is welfare. Actually, not very familiar with this. So actually, I don't think in Pilsen we use the word, quite frankly, social housing, but affordable and public housing are both meant, and I think those terms need to be explained in detail, because that's how communities are pitched against each other. So I just want to make sure that we discuss that as a really, really valid critique and clarification.
Yeah, I'll just say really briefly, at the National Public Housing Museum, we have public in our name intentionally. We do believe in public housing, and I've learned a lot just about the distinction. It's different things in different places too. Like everything is contextual. So it's very good to just hear this. I think what someone put in the chat about public housing being defined as publicly funded and democratically controlled. I think thinking about it from that perspective makes a lot of sense for me, because it means that we're all accountable, right? Like that's what the idea of the public good or the commons is, that we're all accountable. We all are supposed to be holding our officials accountable and doing the work out there in the streets. So that's my 2 cents.
Cool. Okay. So, and I actually think that our last question actually ties in with this pretty well. But this is again for anyone who wants it. But both Dean and Byron brought up public-private partnerships a couple of times, and this sounds great. I love partnerships, but I was hoping you could maybe go a little bit further into what public-private partnership usually actually means in practice. What is its role in public and social housing, and what should be its role? But it might just even start with, what is a public-private partnership, and is it what it sounds like? Because I think that the name can be a little misleading sometimes. Anyone got thoughts on public-private partnerships? We are past 7. We could just close it out, but I just wanted to see if someone maybe wanted to give a little thoughts or clarification.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know that I can give a short one, because I'm not like, there's a bunch of different ways that privatization and public-private partnerships occur, and so I'm not sure if I think there have been some comments that bring up the situation where you have like purely public housing, right, where it's being privatized effectively through public-private partnerships, which is a huge problem, I think, and I think most of us would agree on this call that that's not the route we want to go. I think where it gets a little more complicated, and when we're thinking about it, is like, what if, like, we're trying to push ahead with a bigger vision around municipal housing, for example, land trusts, all that. You do get into some situations where operating that, until you have the infrastructure in place, like with, I mean, we pretty much have a housing authority locally that's like a shell of its former self and barely able to run the few properties like that it still runs. Most of that's been privatized. And then we're talking big about creating thousands of units of municipal housing. So I do think, as a practical matter, where it gets more complicated is not what you're doing with existing public housing, but when you're talking about acquiring property and creating new housing, like the operation of it is often done by the private nonprofit sector. So like when I mentioned, for example, that we're using like state money to buy a building, like the city comes and buys a building in San Francisco, converts it from high-end housing to housing for formerly homeless people, for permanent supportive housing, that is operated by a nonprofit organization. It's owned by the city, right? And it's operated. So there are, and I still think that's like moving in the right direction. I think there's a pretty significant issue in terms of longer term vision, where I think we need to be building out the public sector more to be able to staff those things and operate it, right, and be building municipal jobs and growing municipal jobs to do that. I don't think the future should be even that form of privatization, but it's also like, we're not there, right? So if we can do some of the stuff we want to do in terms of building acquisitions, like we could do that as a city with the money now that we have. I don't think we could, with city staffing, operate all those. And I think that the nonprofits come there. So anyway, so there's a bunch of different partnerships, but I think where it's, I guess I would just say, as the bottom line, where it's often, I think, a little more palatable is where you have the ownership and control by the city entity or by the tenants themselves, like in a land trust. And then it's the operation, the multi-unit buildings, where I think the infrastructure is not yet there to do that in a purely public fashion outside of existing public housing. And I will just say, one final thing on it that and this relates back, Sandy, to your earlier question around kind of what's the path forward, what's the roadmap, I think you said, to abundant social housing, because I think it relates. I the road, there's not going to be the municipal money at the city level, right, to scale up in the way I think any of us envision that we need to meet the need. I see the local work as helping to prevent displacement, but also to model examples of how this can be done successfully, right? So can San Francisco tomorrow do 30,000 units of public housing? Probably not, right? But what we need to do is show that new public housing, can be run well, that that land trusts can succeed, that limited equity co-ops are a viable way, and to do that in as big a way we can with local resources, because I don't see a situation where the state in California or most states around the country, and certainly the federal government, have that much of an interest in really doing this in any meaningful way. I think we're going to have to fund it locally, show that it works, show the difference it makes, change the narrative, and then push that up to state and federal levels to get the resources we're going to need to really scale up.
Thank you.
I just want to.
Yeah, please. I was going
Sorry,
to.
I just want to address one thing in the chat was from earlier that didn't get addressed, which is about redress. And yes, reparations now. I think housing justice has, well, I know billions, because there have been reports, billions of dollars, particularly from the Black community in Chicago and all over the country, has been plundered. And that to me is also the first step. Before we can really move forward, we have to look at the past, and we have to acknowledge the history, be honest, and then we need to do some serious shifting of money and power in this work. And I mean, financial is part of it, but I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of shifting the way that things are working so that we're not repeating mistakes.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. I'm gonna give one last call for our for our panelists to see if you have any final thoughts. And then, I think we can go ahead and log off. But yeah, if anyone has any final thoughts, please go ahead.
I just want to thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to thank you for doing this, and it's really inspiring to see what folks are doing around the country, and also just want to invite folks who want to connect with us. I think Kyle Smealy from my team dropped our info in the chat, and just would invite anyone to follow up anytime. Would love to chat with you. And there's a lot of, I just think there's a lot of great work happening at the local level around the country, and it's inspiring, and it's often seems like we're up against these daunting and horrible forces, and so it's good to connect. I really appreciate you all putting together this forum.
I just want to thank again everybody for the invitation. It's a great discussion. Hopefully we can continue this dialogue, and absolutely we need to this dialogue is ongoing. There were some really quick questions at the end on how we can fight together the privatization of public housing, the pitching communities against each other, right? And I think that this is a great opportunity for us to connect, learn from different experiences, different contexts, the different contexts, different realities. But at the end of the day, I think that we all can agree on it that definitely has been a huge issue with the lack of investment in public housing across the country. I think this is a big challenge of how we stop the privatization, these private-public partnerships that have not done much but continue the privatization schemes to the dismantling and suffering of our most vulnerable communities. Again, the tragedy that it was to see almost 300,000 residents live in the city of Chicago because of lack of affordable housing and public housing options. So the challenge on us and how we build a movement to housing as a human right. And again, I put my information on the chat. Love to continue working together and how we learn and grow with each other. So thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward to working together.
Yep. And I just want to say, keep listening. LaDon said something about like, we're calling it social housing, but have we asked public housing residents what they think? Like, you know, if we're talking about these issues, hopefully we're also grounded in some experiences. And I want to just shout out as a little promo opportunity, Out of the Archives, which is the National Public Housing Museum's monthly listening series, pulls from our archive of residents, public housing, historical and current. So, you know, if you're not in the community and not really prepared to approach somebody directly and start that conversation, here's a way to start your education directly from the source. And thank you, everyone. This has been great.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I also just want to acknowledge the fact that this discussion could very easily have been 5 hours long instead of 1 hour. I mean, there is a lot here. There's a lot to talk about. And it was always sort of meant as an entry point. I think we're there. I think we've entered the entry point, you know, and I really look forward to seeing how we can continue this discussion, even if we can't solve it all tonight. But I just really want to thank everyone for being here and everyone's like very thoughtful input.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to close out the Zoom in just a moment, but good to see everybody. Always appreciate people tuning in on a weeknight to listen and learn. And this will be online soon. So if you want to watch this or share this with others, it should be on YouTube hopefully by tomorrow. So I will send out that information over our Action Network list. If you have not signed our petition already and want to sign to support Just Cause, let me put that in the chat again real quick. But if you sign that petition, you'll get some updates from us about what we're doing for Just Cause in Chicago, and this will be included in that tomorrow. So there's the link for that. And yeah, thanks again so much for everyone for being here.
Thank you. Good night.
All right. 3, 2, 1.